The door slammed shut with such force that it sent a shiver up my spine. I stood rooted in the middle of the room, gazing at the aged wooden walls that felt like they were closing in on me. The air was thick with the scent of dust and damp timber, accompanied by the faint sound of the wind rattling against the cabin. The echoes of the windows reverberated throughout the small space. I hadn't anticipated our trip would kick off like this. We had barely begun unpacking before an overwhelming tension filled the air. There hadn't been a real argument. Nothing concrete had been exchanged, but it was evident that we both sensed something was amiss. We hadn't spent this much time together in years. Not since Mom passed away. This trip was intended to help us reconnect, yet all I felt was an unsettling unease creeping in. Then, suddenly, the sharp sound of glass breaking jolted me from my thoughts. I dashed toward the noise, my heart racing.
Dad.
I hurried over and grabbed his arm. What happened? He looked down at me, his expression a blend of pain and something else I couldn't quite identify. It's fine, he muttered, but the tremor in his voice told a different story. He surveyed the shards of the broken lamp scattered across the floor, his hand instinctively clutching his head. I reached for a nearby towel and pressed it against the cut. The instant our skin touched, an odd current surged through me, reminiscent of the electric charge that hangs in the air before a storm. I tried to dismiss it, to focus solely on the task at hand. But the way he gazed at me, as if searching for something beyond mere assistance, sent my pulse racing.
I'm fine.
Really, he insisted, yet he didn't pull away. His voice was now softer, almost fragile, as if he was trying to reassure both of us. He let out a shaky breath and nodded, sinking down onto the old couch that groaned under his weight. I knelt in front of him, carefully tending to the wound with the towel. His eyes followed my every motion, and the silence between us grew heavier with each passing second. As I treated his cut, I couldn't help but notice how close we were. His face, still so familiar yet oddly different, was mere inches from mine. I could see the lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years, along with a hint of gray in his stubble. Being this close to him felt unsettling after everything that had transpired. "Does it hurt?" I asked, trying to distract myself from the strange tension enveloping us. He shook his head, but his gaze remained fixed on mine. "No, it's just," he started, but the words caught in his throat. There was something unspoken lingering between us, an intangible heaviness that filled the air. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" I frowned, taken aback by his unexpected apology. "It was an accident." "No, not just for this." He averted his gaze, his jaw tightening. "For everything. For not being there when you needed me. For letting things get so messed up." I blinked, taken aback by the raw emotion in his voice. This wasn't the dad I remembered, the one who always buried his feelings deep down. This was something else, something vulnerable. "Dad, it's not your fault." My words felt feeble as they slipped out. I wasn't sure what else to say. Seeing him like this frightened me. He shut his eyes for a moment, drawing a deep breath before meeting my gaze once more. "I should have done better after your mom," he said, his voice cracking as he stared at the floor. "I just didn't know how to cope. With you. With everything." A knot tightened in my stomach. I had harbored so much anger towards him, frustrated by his distance after Mom died. But hearing him express it so plainly, seeing the pain etched in his eyes, hit me harder than I anticipated. I was at a loss for words. A part of me longed to comfort him, to assure him that it was all right, that I understood. Yet another part of me, one I fought hard to suppress, ignited a flicker of frustration, perhaps even resentment. "I was there too, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't the only one who lost someone." The weight of my words hung heavily in the air between us. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, I regretted speaking up. But then he nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I know," he murmured, "and I'm sorry for not being there for you, when you needed me the most." I swallowed hard, trying to rein in the emotions surging inside me. The bleeding from his head had ceased, but the ache in my chest intensified. "I think we both made mistakes," I finally said, my voice trembling. But we're here now. That's what counts, right? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a glimmer of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Yeah, he replied softly. Yeah, it does. I stood up, stepping back to grant him space, yet the weight of the moment still pressed down on me. So much remained unspoken between us, but for now, this was sufficient. I turned away, attempting to collect my thoughts when he spoke again. Thank you, he murmured almost too quietly for me to hear. I glanced back, surprised. For what? For being here, he said, his eyes locked onto mine, for not giving up on me. Unsure how to respond, I simply nodded. My heart raced as I walked out of the room. Leaning against the wall in the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something subtle yet undeniable. And it frightened me. Our trip had just begun, but already I sensed that nothing would ever be the same. The following morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, I stepped outside. The brisk air cut against my skin, refreshing yet sharp enough to slice through to my bones. But I didn't mind. I needed a moment to clear my head and shake off the heaviness from the previous night. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and strolled down to the lake's edge. The water lay calm, almost unnaturally so, reflecting the gray sky above with eerie perfection. I heard his footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me before I saw him approach. I didn't turn around right away. Instead, I fixed my gaze on the water, grappling with how to express what I felt. This place was so isolated and quiet that it was impossible to escape the tumult of thoughts racing in my mind. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk to him. I just wasn't certain how to start. When he finally stood beside me, he remained silent as well. We stood there together, side by side, staring out at the lake and pretending everything was perfectly fine. I could feel his presence heavy and close, and I had to work hard to keep my breathing even. You okay? He asked, his voice gentle and cautious, as if he were afraid to disrupt the fragile peace we had established the night before. I nodded, still hesitant to trust my voice. My attention drifted to a ripple in the water, watching it expand and move farther away from us. It felt like a metaphor for everything, a small feeling at first, but growing, reaching out into the unknown. Do you want to take the boat out? He suggested, nodding toward the old rowboat tied to the dock. I glanced at the boat, then back at him. It was an innocent enough suggestion, but something about it twisted my stomach. Being alone on the water, with just the sound of our oars dipping in and out, felt too intimate, too much like an escape. Yet, despite my apprehensions, I found myself nodding again.
Yeah, sure.
We walked in silence to the dock, the weathered wood creaking beneath our feet as we carefully crossed the planks. He untied the rope from the boat and held it steady as I climbed in, the small vessel rocking slightly under my weight. I took a seat at the front, facing him as he pushed us away from the dock and began to row. The water remained eerily still, almost glass-like, as we glided further from shore. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us said a word. The only sounds were the soft splash of the oars and the occasional call of a bird from the trees. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't find my calm. My thoughts raced back to the night before, replaying how his voice had cracked when he apologized, how his eyes softened with regret. I caught him glancing at me from time to time, but he would quickly look away whenever I turned to meet his gaze. It felt like an invisible barrier existed between us, one we both yearned to break through but were too frightened to approach. Eventually, the silence became unbearable, and I finally found the courage to speak. Do you think things will ever feel normal again? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't even sure what normal meant anymore. Since Mom's passing, nothing had felt right. In truth, nothing had felt normal for years. He paused his rowing, letting the boat drift for a moment. His brow furrowed as he stared out at the water, contemplating his response. I don't know, he finally admitted. I hope so, but I don't think it'll ever be the same. His candor caught me off guard. I had anticipated some comforting words, a reassuring lie about how time heals all wounds or that everything would eventually fall back into place. But he didn't offer that. He couldn't because we both understood the truth. I looked away, focusing on the water again. The boat rocked gently with the lake's movement, the slight sway making me feel unsteady. I guess I just keep hoping that one day I'll wake up and feel like I used to, I confessed. Like everything is okay again. He observed me carefully, his hands gripping the oars tightly.
You've been through a lot, he said.
We both have. It's all right to not feel okay. I nodded, uncertain of how to reply. His words resonated, yet they didn't provide solace. I wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, relief, but all I felt was numbness. He resumed rowing, this time slowly, as if granting me the space to process everything. The silence stretched between us once again, thick and heavy like a fog that wouldn't lift as we neared the lake's center. The water appeared darker now, as though it held secrets beneath its surface. I felt his gaze on me once more, but this time I didn't shy away. I met his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, we simply looked at each other. There was something in his expression, raw and unspoken, that quickened my pulse, compelling me to glance down at my hands. "What are you thinking?" I asked, my voice quivering slightly. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know his answer, but the question slipped out before I could stop it. He hesitated, the oars halting in the water. "I'm just wondering if we'll ever return to where we were before everything changed." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump forming in my throat. "I don't know if we can," I replied softly. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite define. Sadness, perhaps. Or regret. He nodded, his grip on the oars tightening. "Yeah, I guess you're right." The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating and final. I stared at the still water, my reflection distorted by the gentle ripples created by the boat. The silence lingered, and I found myself wishing we hadn't ventured out here at all. As we turned back toward the shore, the distance between us felt more pronounced than ever. The fire crackled softly, its warmth barely reaching the edges of the clearing as the evening chill settled in. I sat cross-legged on the ground, close enough to feel the heat on my face, but far enough away that the cool breeze from the lake still brushed against my skin. He settled onto an old log, absent-mindedly stirring the flames with a stick while lost in thought. Above us, the sky had deepened into a rich navy blue, and stars began to blink into existence one by one. It was the sort of night that felt infinite, as if the world outside our small circle of light had ceased to exist. I leaned back on my elbows, taking a moment to absorb the tranquil surroundings. This moment carried a peacefulness that was hard to articulate. Despite the chaos swirling in my mind, an unexpected calm washed over me. The crackling fire, the gentle rustle of the trees, and the way the flames flickered and danced all created a cocoon where nothing else seemed to matter. And as much as I had been wrestling with my feelings, one undeniable truth stood out. I truly enjoyed being here with him. It hadn't always been this way. After Mom passed away, I had distanced myself, retreating into a world where I could avoid confronting the reality of our broken relationship. However, this trip, a secluded escape into the wilderness, felt like a fresh start, a chance to mend what had been lost. "You know," I said, breaking the comfortable silence that enveloped us, "I didn't expect to enjoy this trip as much as I do." He glanced at me, clearly surprised. "Really? I wasn't sure how you would feel about it either." A small, genuine smile crept onto my face, one I hadn't realized I'd been suppressing. "I thought it might be awkward, just the two of us out here, but it's actually quite nice." "I'm really glad we're doing this," he replied, his expression softening. For a brief moment, the distance that had been growing between us seemed to shrink. "Me too," he said quietly, poking at the fire once more, sending sparks soaring into the night sky, illuminating his face in the dim light. "It's been a long time since we've done anything like this." I nodded, pulling my knees up to my chest and wrapping my arms around them. "I didn't realize how much I missed it," I confessed. "There was a time long ago when we frequently embarked on trips like this, camping, hiking, taking aimless road trips. Back then, it was all about fun and adventure, a way to escape the mundane. But now, it felt like something deeper, a means to reconnect, to rediscover what had once come so naturally between us." "I was just thinking about that hike we took in the Rockies," I said, chuckling at the memory. Do you remember how we got completely lost for about 3 hours? He laughed, shaking his head. I didn't get us lost. I just opted for a more scenic route. Sure, a scenic route without a map or a cell signal. Mom was furious when we finally made it back. A wistful expression crossed his face. She always had a better sense of direction. We fell silent for a moment, the weight of her absence settling over us like a familiar shadow. Yet, it wasn't the painful silence it once was. Instead, it felt like a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding that we both carried her memory with us in our own unique ways. I guess what I'm trying to express is, I continued, feeling compelled to fill the space between us with words, I'm really enjoying this. I didn't expect to, but I am. It feels good to be out here with you. He took a moment before responding, but I could see gratitude reflected in his eyes. Setting the stick down, he leaned back, mirroring my posture, his gaze drifting up to the stars. I've missed this, too, he confessed, his voice low. I've missed you. The sincerity in his tone made my heart swell. I could tell he meant it. For the first time in ages, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this trip could signal the beginning of something new between us. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and I watched them disappear into the darkness. It was amusing how something as simple as a campfire could create a sense of normalcy, if only for a moment. Taking a deep breath, I allowed the cool night air to fill my lungs, surrendering to the serenity of the moment. I don't think I've ever seen the stars like this, I remarked after a pause, my eyes fixed on the sky. It's so clear out here. You can see every single star. He looked up and nodded in agreement. That's one of the best parts about being out here. No city lights to drown them out. We lapsed into silence again, simply enjoying the spectacle of the stars above us. The fire was beginning to dwindle, the flames reducing to glowing embers. The chill in the air was becoming more pronounced, but I didn't want to move. I was reluctant to disrupt the fragile peace that had settled between us. At that moment, I realized how much I valued being here, not just in nature, but with him. There was something beautiful about the simplicity of it all. No distractions, no external noise. Everything felt more genuine, more honest. I hadn't anticipated feeling this way, so connected to him after all that had happened. Yet, here I was, sitting beside the fire and experiencing a comfort I hadn't felt in years. Do you ever think about doing this more often? I asked, half joking, half serious. He looked over at me, his expression contemplative. I'd really like that, he said after a moment's thought. If you're up for it. I smiled, warmth flooding through me that had nothing to do with the fire. Yeah, I think I am. We sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the fire slowly fade to glowing coals. The night was still, the stars shining brightly above us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a profound sense that we were finally beginning to understand each other again. It felt as if we were both ready to leave the past behind and embark on a new beginning. As the last embers of the fire faded, a strange contentment washed over me. This trip, this quiet and simple escape, was precisely what I hadn't realized I needed. The following day dawned bright, the morning sun filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the forest floor. I awoke to the cheerful sound of birds chirping, a rhythmic melody that felt like it belonged to another world, one where everything was uncomplicated and serene. It was a comforting illusion, even if it didn't entirely match the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. I slipped on my jacket and stepped outside, the crisp air invigorating against my skin. The remnants of last night's campfire lay in a circle of ash, the faint scent of burnt wood lingering in the cool morning breeze. I scanned the clearing, expecting to see him already awake, perhaps cooking breakfast or exploring the nearby woods. But the area was empty. I assumed he was off somewhere close, and for the first time, I realized I didn't feel the usual awkwardness that accompanied our time apart. However, that sense of tranquility didn't last long. As I wandered toward the small path that led down to the lake, I heard a voice, his voice, speaking softly. It was quiet, almost too low to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. I halted, straining to catch what he was saying. It was unusual for him to speak like that, especially when he believed no one was listening. Curiosity mixed with unease as I crept closer, careful not to step on any twigs or dried leaves that might betray my presence. As I neared, I realized he was on the phone, his back to me, standing near the edge of the dock with the lake stretching out behind him like a shimmering sheet. He sounded different, not quite nervous, but there was an intensity in his voice that drew my attention. I took another step forward, just close enough to catch snippets of his conversation. "Yeah, the dealership said it'll be ready in about 4 months," he was saying, his voice low. "I just want it to be perfect. She deserves it. After everything." I froze, the word striking me like a punch to the gut. A dealership for months? My heart began to race as my mind jumped to conclusions I couldn't control. He was talking about me. I was certain of it. There was no one else it could be. But what exactly was he planning? What could possibly take 4 months to prepare? And why the secrecy? I edged closer, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation. He wasn't one for big surprises, not since everything had changed. But this felt different. I couldn't shake the notion that whatever he was planning would change everything. "I want it to be a surprise," he continued, his voice soft yet resolute. "She's been through so much, and I think it'll really mean something to her." Leaning against a nearby tree, my mind spun. He was orchestrating something significant, something deeply personal, and the sincerity in his words tightened my chest. I knew I shouldn't be eavesdropping, but I couldn't pull myself away. I needed to know what he was discussing. Then, as if the universe had decided to answer the questions swirling in my head, he stated it plainly. "A new car. She's always wanted one, and I figured it's time. 4 months from now, it'll be ready." The air rushed out of my lungs in a single gasp. A car? He was buying me a car? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the sheer weight of the surprise, the realization that he had been planning this behind my back. It all hit me at once. He hadn't mentioned a word about it or even dropped a hint. And yet, here he was, quietly arranging the whole thing as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. I slowly backed away, careful to avoid any noise that might reveal I had been listening. I wasn't ready to confront him about what I had just learned. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, each one more overwhelming than the last. Why now? Why a car? Why hadn't he said anything? I slipped back toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of the secret pressed down on me, and suddenly everything felt different. It wasn't just about the car. It represented something much deeper. He was trying to make things right, offering me something tangible that said, "I care." Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was about more than just the car. It was about something we hadn't yet addressed between us. I sank onto the porch steps, gazing out at the trees as I tried to process everything. The forest silence amplified the chaos in my head. How was I supposed to act normal after this? How could I pretend I didn't know what he was planning? All I wanted was to confront him, to ask why he felt the need to do something so grand, so out of character. When he finally returned, I looked up at him, striving to keep my expression neutral. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, and sat down beside me on the steps. "Beautiful morning," he remarked, glancing out at the same view I had been staring at for the last 15 minutes. I nodded, unable to trust my voice just yet. He stretched his legs out before him, leaning back on his elbows. After a lengthy pause, he finally spoke again, his voice softer and tinged with seriousness. "You've been quiet today," he remarked, glancing at me from the corner of his eye. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile and nodded quickly. "Yeah, just thinking." He acknowledged my words with a nod, not pressing for more details, yet I could sense his curiosity. I wondered if he could tell that I had overheard his conversation earlier. However, he didn't ask, and I didn't offer any additional information. As the day progressed, my mind remained preoccupied, constantly drifting back to that phone call. The idea of the car loomed large in my thoughts. It was a significant surprise, but it was also a symbol, an emblem of the efforts he was making to mend our relationship. But I couldn't shake the uncertainty of whether I was ready for that. Ready for the implications of what he was trying to do. By the time the sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows across the clearing. I still hadn't mentioned anything. I felt lost for how to approach the subject. One thing became clear, though. This trip was no longer merely about reconnecting. It was about something much more profound, something that would be unfolding in 4 months, regardless of my readiness. As the afternoon sun hung low in the sky, it filtered golden rays through the trees while we ventured out for another walk. The day felt warmer than it had since we arrived, and the air was filled with the comforting sense of pine and damp earth. I walked a few steps ahead of him, trying to shake off the persistent thoughts of the secret I had overheard that morning. My mind churned with questions I hadn't dared to voice, yet there was an unexplainable warmth blooming in my chest. He had hidden something so significant from me. A surprise, sure, but it felt like more. It was a statement, a way of conveying all the things we hadn't dared to say in years. I still wasn't sure how to process it all, feeling grateful, confused, and even a touch guilty for learning it before he had a chance to share. I was thinking. His voice suddenly cut through the sound of our footsteps crunching along the trail. Maybe we could head into town tomorrow, check out some shops, and grab lunch. I turned my head to look back at him. His tone seemed casual, but I could detect the effort behind it, as if he was trying to maintain a light atmosphere. Yeah, that sounds nice, I replied, my voice a touch too high and hurried. I caught myself and added more gently, I'd like that. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. I could feel the tension lingering between us, unspoken yet palpable. It was the same feeling that had been bubbling up inside me since I learned about the car. I still didn't know how to bring it up, if I even should, but the weight of it was becoming harder to ignore. As we continued walking, the trees began to thin, and we reached the edge of a clearing. In the middle stood a large flat rock, ideal for sitting and watching the sun sink toward the horizon. I moved over to it and sat down, pulling my knees to my chest. He followed, taking a seat beside me while keeping a comfortable distance. For a time, we sat in silence, observing as the sky shifted from bright blue to gentle shades of orange and pink. It was breathtaking and tranquil, the kind of scene you might find in a reflective movie moment where characters come to profound realizations. Yet I didn't feel that peace, not truly. I kept stealing glances at him, waiting for the right moment, the right words to discuss what I had overheard. Each time I opened my mouth, the words seemed to stick in my throat. It felt inappropriate to bring it up now, with everything so serene and the sun setting before us. And yet it was all-consuming. He finally broke the silence. I'm really glad we did this. I turned to him. He was still gazing out at the horizon, his face contemplative. Yeah, I replied softly, barely above a whisper. Me too. There was something different about him at that moment. He appeared more relaxed, more open. Yet there was also a heaviness in his expression that I hadn't noticed before, as if he was carrying an unseen burden. Things haven't been easy for us, he continued, his tone careful and deliberate. I know I haven't always been there like I should have, especially after your mom. I could hear the tremor in his voice when he mentioned her. He didn't need to elaborate. I understood the implications. We had danced around this conversation countless times, both of us avoiding it because it was too painful. But now, sitting here with the sun dipping low and the air cooling, it felt like the time had come to confront the truth. You don't need to apologize, I said quietly. I know it was hard for you. He nodded slowly, but his jaw tightened. I know, but I still feel like I should have done better for you. I looked down at my hands, picking at a loose thread on my sweater. We both did the best we could, I said, even though I wasn't entirely convinced of that. Maybe we had, but it still felt like there were unresolved issues between us, something we hadn't fully addressed. A heavy silence fell over us, thicker than before. I could feel the words rising within me, desperate to be spoken. The words I had been holding back surged forth, begging to be expressed. The secret about the car, everything I'd been keeping inside since that morning, it all wanted to spill out. I yearned to tell him I knew, to release it all. Yet something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear of tarnishing this rare moment of honesty between us. Or maybe it was a truth I wasn't quite ready to confront myself. Then, almost instinctively, The words burst forth before I could stop them. I know about the car. The instant I said it, I regretted my choice. His head whipped around, his eyes wide with surprise. I could see shock register on his face, quickly followed by confusion. And then, something deeper, something resembling disappointment.
How?
He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I overheard you this morning. I confessed, my words tumbling out in a rush.
You were on the phone talking about it.
I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help it. He was silent for a moment, just staring at me as if trying to process what I had just revealed. I wanted it to be a surprise. He finally said, his tone low and laced with hurt, which made my chest tighten. I know, I replied quickly. I didn't mean to ruin it. I didn't know how to act after I found out. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, but striving to remain composed. It's not just about the car, you know. It's about showing you that I still care, that I want to fix things between us. His words hung heavily in the air, raw and charged with emotion. I could feel the weight of everything he had been holding in. I know, I said softly, and I really appreciate it. But you don't need to buy me a car to prove that.
I just want us to be okay.
I want things to feel normal again. He looked at me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw vulnerability in his eyes. I don't know if things will ever feel normal again, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I want to try. We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of our conversation settling around us. The sky had grown darker, the last remnants of sunlight fading into the horizon. The air was cooler now, and I shivered slightly, pulling my jacket tighter around me. After what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence again, his voice gentler than before. You still want the car? I couldn't help but laugh, a small, nervous sound that broke the tension between us. Yeah, I admitted, smiling despite myself. I still want the car. He smiled back, and for the first time in ages it felt like we might just be okay. The last day of our trip carried a different energy, like the stillness before a storm. The morning was cool, the sun obscured by a thick layer of clouds that cast a muted light over everything. I stood by the cabin window, staring out at the forest stillness. The weight of the previous night's conversation lingered between us, unspoken yet palpable. It felt as if we had crossed a threshold, but I couldn't tell if it meant we were better off or had merely complicated things further. I hadn't intended to bring up the car, but once the words escaped, there was no taking them back. Now, everything seemed to shift. I could feel his efforts to mend our relationship, yet it also heightened the distance between us. We couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine, especially when so much had changed. The truth was, I wasn't even sure what okay looked like anymore. When I heard the familiar creak of the old floorboards, I turned away from the window. He was in the kitchen, moving about with the quiet efficiency he always displayed in the mornings as he made coffee, probably packing up the last of our things. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cabin, a comforting yet bittersweet reminder that our time here was drawing to a close. I didn't want to leave, not yet. Despite everything, despite the tension and uncertainty, this trip had felt essential for both of us. It was a break from the outside world, a reprieve from the weight of daily life. Out here, it was just the two of us, stripped of distractions and forced to confront one another and ourselves. But now, with the end looming, I was uncertain about where we stood. Our plan for the day was simple. One last walk through the woods, pack up the car, and head home. It should have been straightforward, but there was an unspoken heaviness in the air, something unresolved that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, craving the fresh air to clear my mind. The forest was still and quiet, the kind of silence that heightened my awareness of every little sound, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the distant call of a bird, the soft creak of the old porch as he stepped outside to join me. I glanced back at him, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. There was a question in his gaze, something unsaid. But before I could ponder it too much, he offered me a small smile and asked, "Ready for one last walk?" His voice was soft but steady. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. We fell into step together, making our way down the familiar path that wound through the trees toward the lake. The stillness between us was not awkward, yet it felt dense, as if we were both anticipating something that might disrupt it. As we continued walking, I found myself stealing glances at him more frequently than usual. There was a certain ease in his movements, a sense of relaxation I hadn't noticed in him for ages. It seemed like this trip had lifted a burden off his shoulders, if only temporarily. However, that familiar look lingered in his eyes, the unasked question that hung there, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront it. When we arrived at the lake, the water lay perfectly still, mirroring the overcast sky above. I paused at the water's edge, peering out across the lake, my mind a tangled web of everything we had discussed, and everything left unsaid. He stood beside me, hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes glued to the horizon. "You know," he began after a lengthy silence, "this place really makes you reflect, doesn't it?" I nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it does." He shifted slightly, maintaining his focus on the lake. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, and everything that has transpired. I know I haven't been the greatest father, and while I'm not expecting you to overlook that, I want you to know that I'm making an effort. I genuinely want our relationship to improve." There it was, the unspoken topic we had been tiptoeing around this entire time. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to respond. "I know," I said softly. "I can see that you're trying." He turned to face me, his expression inscrutable. "Do you believe we can reach that point? Can we be okay?" The question lingered heavily in the air, saturated with everything we had yet to untangle. I wanted to assure him, to say that everything would turn out fine and that we could revert to how things used to be. But the reality was that I wasn't sure, and I questioned whether that was even what I wanted. "I don't know," I confessed, my voice barely audible. "I think we're making progress, but it's going to take time." He nodded slowly, as if he had anticipated that response but was still processing it. "I'm prepared to wait, no matter how long it takes." There was a genuine sincerity in his tone that tightened my chest. For the first time, I believed him. I felt he truly wanted things to improve, not just for my sake but for his as well. Yet, the implications of that desire, and what it would require from both of us, felt too daunting to fully comprehend. We stood in silence for a while, each lost in our own reflections, watching the gentle ripples on the lake stirred by a soft breeze. Then, unexpectedly, he reached for my hand. It was a small gesture, one that might have seemed trivial in any other context, but in that moment, it felt monumental. His hand was warm and steady, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. But just as swiftly as it had arrived, the moment shifted. I sensed him pulling away, his grip loosening, and when I looked at him, I noticed a change in his eyes, a look that hadn't been there before. His face was inscrutable, his gaze distant, and all at once, I felt the weight of everything we hadn't voiced crashing down on me. "I need to tell you something," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were struggling to articulate the right words. "Something I should have shared with you a long time ago." I stared at him, my heart racing. The atmosphere between us was charged, heavy with the importance of whatever he was about to say. But before he could continue, a sound interrupted us, soft at first but unmistakable. The rumble of distant thunder, growing louder with each passing second. The once muted gray sky had darkened, ominous clouds rolling in from the horizon. A storm was imminent. He glanced up at the sky, his expression tense. "We should head back," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. "The storm is approaching quickly." I nodded, but the words I wanted to say were caught in my throat. So many questions swirled in my mind, so much I needed to understand. Yet as the storm closed in, the moment slipped away. We turned to walk back, the wind picking up around us, leaves swirling at our feet. As we walked side by side, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. Whatever he had almost revealed would have transformed everything, but now, with the storm looming, I wondered if I would ever discover what it was. We reached the cabin just as the first raindrops began to fall, and as I stepped inside, a strange blend of emotions washed over me. Relief, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite identify. I glanced back at him, his face obscured by the fading light, and for the first time, I questioned whether we would ever truly be okay.